Managed Mentoring Guide for Getting Started in Beekeeping. Preparations for the Fall Nectar Flow. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we'll talk about some key indicator plants that let you know when the fall nectar sources are going to come alive. We'll talk about assessing fall objectives. Where is your hive now, and what state do you have to get to as you progress depending on your situation? If you're fortunate enough to be one of those individuals that's ready for a fall harvest, we'll talk your way through some concepts to make sure that you have a plan and you're ready to go to get your honey harvest in and done. If for some reason bees collect extraneous nectar, but they don't cap it off, we have to give you a solution to that. And we'll end with some big picture assessments to make sure that you understand what the finish line looks like when we get to the end of fall. As the year progresses, we continue to try and think of what comes next and ensure that we have a plan to address what's coming. This continues with the theme of plan the work and work the plan. In this lesson, we see from the slide that fall plants will soon turn the corner, and I often look for clues in the year as to pivot points to remind me to plan for what comes next. Currently, the daylilies are in abundance in our region, and for me personally, they are the summer milestone. That ironically makes me think fall is coming. We will soon see the asters and the goldenrod and other plants that come to signify a fall nectar flow, and depending on where you are, you need to see the activities in advance and plan for what your next actions are. As we consider our plan, we should keep in mind that each colony is different and each beekeeping season is also different. Some years, new beekeepers make honey in their first spring, and some years it's mission accomplished to build out the brood in anticipation of next year's harvest. Where you stand in this season, the premise of this lesson is to help you think what comes next and get a baseline of activities planned in anticipation of fall. For some of you, there is some planning required and steps to review, so it's not too early to consider your path. So where do you fall on the continuum? Some beekeepers just started their nukes in June and are looking to get to 2 full boxes. Some had their packages that are far past 2 boxes and might have harvested some honey. Most customarily are somewhere in the middle given our notes from previous seasons. You need to assess where you are and consider your objectives for fall. At minimum, you want 2 brood boxes or 3 mediums full of healthy bees and resources for the winter. That is your fall objective. For some of you, you're on your way to that and could benefit from the possibility of bees drawing out some honey supers, so you have a jump start on next season. Others already have drawn comb in their honey supers and could look to collect a fall harvest if that's in the cards for you at your location. More on that in a moment. You fall somewhere in this spectrum, and we will walk you through instructions for each condition in the next few slides. We just recognize that you could be in different situations and you might not care about this particular one, but in future seasons you might find yourself facing this. So it's kind of interesting to pay attention to all of these even if they don't apply. So first and foremost, for year 1, it's 2 healthy brood boxes full of bees, resources, and clean, non-parasitized bees. For those that are not there yet, keep feeding. And everyone needs to be sure that you're rearing clean bees by following the guidance in the varroa mite lessons. Everyone also needs to have a healthy queen, a box full of bees, and at least 60 to 80 pounds of capped honey in the brood boxes come fall. Summer, leading into fall, is where you keep the hives flush, and in fall we coach you how to switch over to a ratio of 2-to-1 sugar solution in anticipation of Halloween. For now, your task is to feed the bees in the first year as they need it, and ensure that they are not depleted and set them up for fall. Trickle feeding them now makes the fall task of feeding a little bit easier. For those that need to build out 2 boxes still, feeding helps sustain the bees for building wax and continued brood rearing when the nectar flow of spring tapers off. It's natural for the queen to cut back, and that's okay, but some of the extra bees through stimulative feeding help bolster the population of bees going into winter. The superorganism has an easier job getting through cold winter when they have some additional bees and plenty of resources. That will be evident when we get to the overwintering lessons to come later in the season. Stepping up to the next level of readiness, if the colony has 2 full boxes of bees, then you can turn to your honey supers. Ideally, if they did not get there for you, then you could try to get the bees to build out some honeycomb. Just simply place your honey supers over the brood nest, feed the bees, and then when the fall nectar flow sets in, they may have a spurt of brood building and provide you with the new young wax-making bees that could potentially draw out some of your frames in fall. Whatever you can achieve, it is your benefit, as drawn comb is beekeeper gold. The next level of instructions are for those who are ready to collect a fall harvest. But before you do that, you have to make sure that you have the right conditions to put honey boxes on where you're not going to cause some issues to yourself. If you had treatments on the hives, you have to allow them to run their course. Make sure that you read the label and follow the directions, including buffer times for when you remove, say, apivar, that you leave the right time for the product to dissipate so that it does not end up in your honey. In addition, if you're doing any feeding at the time that you're putting your honey supers on, you're going to want to cease that practice, as the bees do sometimes take sugar solution and transform it and store it in honey boxes, and you do not want funny honey, as we call it, honey that was derived from sugar solution instead of nectar from nature. Climbing the rung one more time, for those of you who had both full complement of bees in the brood chamber and drawn honeycomb, you could now contemplate putting those over top of the super to collect nectar and hopefully honey by the time fall comes to a close. The bees on a good season and in a good location will get to the finish line. They'll fill and cap the comb, and you can enjoy the bounty of a fall harvest. But you have to keep in mind that in some places, it's just the nature of the beast that you're not going to see a drop of fall nectar or a float to speak of. It's also true, as we mentioned a moment ago, that every year is different. Some years have great fall flows. They come in abundance, and other years they're rather thin. With conditions, it's plausible to see incidental nectar storage in your comb, wet and uncapped, and the bees get to cold weather, and that's as far as it gets. Bees might load a handful of frames with nectar and cap the middle ones, while the fringe areas have wet nectar stored and the outer frames are dry. As a beekeeper, we will not want this in the hive going into winter. It's never going to finish, and it's not at a stage where it can be harvested. So what can we do with it? Well, the short answer is, unfortunately, we have to get it off. We are not going to go into winter with partially filled honey supers over the colony. Let's put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that notion and go to the flip side. You've put your honey supers on, fall harvest is done, they filled them up, they capped them, and now you're in harvest mode. A couple things to keep in mind. It is far easier to spin out the honey in an extractor when the temperatures are warm. Try to spin out cool frames that have been in storage in colder weather, and it's really, really difficult to get it to come out of the cells, even if you have an extractor on full tilt. So as you get your nectar flow done in your area and you find that you have honey to harvest from a fall flow, make sure you have an immediate plan while the temperatures are still viable to extract that honey. You don't want to leave it laying around all winter. You're going to need to get it out of the comb and do a full honey harvest and bottle. In addition, when you finish spitting out your frames in an extractor, you're going to want to have the bees clean them up. When they're spun out and they still contain some vestiges of nectar that's wet or honey that's wet, you don't want to store them that way. And so you'll have to have a plan to put them over the bees and have them clean them out, or set them out in the property and have selective robbing. Again, look at the robbing lesson coming up for more information on that. But the key here is to understand that you have to have a plan. We put a pin in wet supers and now we can come back to it. To set the stage for what you should do with them, you do not want to put them away with nectar stored in the comb. Even in the cold, you'll have ants, you'll have mice or something will find them, bugs. And really what would be ideal is if they were cleaned out. One strategy to deal with this is to take the wet honey supers and place them over an inner cover. It would require you to have some additional piece of equipment, which is an inner cover to place between the brood boxes and your honey supers, and then you would keep the traditional inner cover over top of the honey supers and under the roof. The premise of this particular approach is that the bees will come through the hole in the lower inner cover, see the resources above, and consider that no man's land, collect what's in there, and bring it back down into the brood chamber, especially as the weather gets colder. I'm going to say to you right now that I've tried this practice. I know it's talked about all the time. I have not had a phenomenal amount of success with it. I would turn to options 2 and 3. Option 2 being open feed those frames, put them out somewhere on your property, and the third option would be to shake out the contents into the grass, but more on that in a moment. To expand upon the tactical practice to deal with unripened nectar and use the bees' opportunistic forage behavior on your behalf, if you have the right situation, your property is big enough, you could take your incomplete honey supers out into your property far away from your hives, and the bees will find them, steal the contents out of the cells, and bring them back into the colony. If you're going to do this practice, of course, you'd want to remove any honey supers off of all the hives so that they're going to store it down into the brood chamber. There's a plus to this, and a warning is required. The first thing to say is the bees will treat this like any other nectar flow source and bring it all back to the nest. However, sometimes the appearance of this unexplained, unusual bounty results in turning the bees on a quest to find more. Another way to say this is that sometimes it can result in an opportunistic foraging behavior called robbing. If you feed afar, it could result in the colony turning on the quest to inspect other places, including the nearby hives, for resources to get through to overwintering. It's a risk to be aware of, but in practice, healthy colonies defend against robbing, and, well, honestly, a lot of beekeepers employ this pragmatic process to get their wet honey supers empty, and all the work that the bees did to put it in the comb is not thwarted. They're able to at least take advantage of it and bring it back to the hives. Let's talk about the practical instructions of how to conduct this activity if you are planning to put the boxes out somewhere on your property for the bees to find. In the right situation, open feeding can work, but you'd want these boxes placed somewhere out in isolation, not near where people will be, not near dogs or anything, because there's going to be likely the potential for a cloud of bees robbing out this resource. Ideally, it will be hundreds of yards away, or at least someplace where there's a bunch of different items in between the actual colony and the place where you place the boxes. A house, a fence, some cars, big trees. That way, when the bees exit the hive in quest of finding the box, they can orient around different objects, and that makes it perceived to be more like something they found as a resource out in nature versus this is a hive to rob, and then I would turn back to the other hives when I'm done with this resource. So make sure, preferably, that it's as far away as possible and set it up with a bunch of barriers in between. It bears reiterating again that one thing you have to consider about open feeding is you're creating the possibility of an onslaught of bees working in a big cloud to take advantage of the bounty they have just found. For a period of time, don't underestimate this, there could be a massive amount of activity and you need to plan for that. Well, sometimes open feeding, no matter how well intentioned, is not a good fit for your property, and it would be best for you to go another route. If giving back to the bees over the inner cover, outer cover situation is not a good way to go, then you can, I hate to say, shake out the gathered nectar. You want to simply hold the frame with the face flat to the earth and give it some vigorous shakes. Quickly jolting it to a stop will overcome the tension of the liquid in the cell, and it's going to dislodge most of the content. Now, with this process, you may be really successful, or because maybe the nectar is ripened just a touch, you may not be able to clear all the contents out, and that's to be expected depending on how far the bees have gotten. For what is left, you can temporarily stash these frames in the open somewhere exposed to the air and let them dry out naturally. You could speed this along with moving air through setting up a fan or some sort of place where the air moves constantly. Use some common sense, however, when you go about this, as whatever you're setting up will be an attractive source for ants and other insects that could smell, find, and seize the opportunity. Now, when you're doing this, maybe you want to consider actually bringing them inside in a humidity-controlled place. Dry air makes the job far more feasible, and high humidity is not your friend in this operation. Once the frames are dry, you can put them away and plan for use of them in the next time that the nectar flow comes. In summary, no matter where you land on the continuum of your progress, your job is to assess the situation now and make a plan to go down the right path. Job number one is to get the colony to overwinter state, and you need clean, healthy bees flush with stores by Halloween. If you can work in building comb or even a fall nectar flow, well, that's all the better. Also, don't forget that if you are getting to the stage of a fall harvest, make sure that you have a plan going in. How are you going to extract the honey before cold weather sets in? How are you going to bottle it? What are you going to do with the wet honeycomb after you've done extracting it? Make sure that you have a full plan all the way through. Summertime is the right idea for getting prepped so that you are quick and efficient in your operation come fall. In this lesson, we talked about the progression of your hive going into fall, and for those of you who are set to do a fall honey flow, your steps to get yourself to the finish line on that. Our next round of lessons focus on a couple things you need to pay attention to over summer. One, summer queen problems. It is something that happens, and you want to make sure you remain vigilant to catch it early if it's going to happen. In this lesson, we covered a couple ideas about robbing, but we're going to have a full lesson covering the dynamics of robbing events and what to do about them, what they look like, and how to deal with them. You have to be prepared for a potential mite infestation in the fall. It's something you may not be aware of. We'll give you the backstory on that. And if you find yourself heading out of summer into fall and you have some colonies that are in trouble, we'll provide some guidance on how to prop them up. That's all coming up in the next round of lessons. If you have some questions about this lesson or anything in general, you can come to some of our online sessions. Or you can leave a comment from the video here. If you're watching from our website, click on the link to YouTube and you can leave a comment there. Make sure that you subscribe while you're there. The other thing you could do is send an email to comments@managementoring.com and someone will write you back. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.